Welcome to the Point. We have a jam-packed show this morning. We start with a conversation about the water contamination in Kent County with State Representative Rob VerHeulen. Representative, let's talk about something that we have talked about, unfortunately, too much. We've had to, and that is the contamination of water systems in northern Kent County, in the northern half of Kent County, centered around Rockford, Belmont, some of the areas that you represent, and the ongoing efforts on your part and some of your colleagues to try to come up with a way to at least clean up the water if you can't clean up the contamination with this PFAS. So talk to me about the $750,000 that was announced this past week.
Yes. Well, back in December, the legislature had appropriated a supplemental appropriation for dealing with PFAS, and I think it was about $23 million. And so Representative Affandoulis and Senator McGregor and I wrote a letter to the director of the DEQ asking that the department consider using a portion of that $23 million to implement a test, a pilot, if you will, for Plainfield Township, and that is a carbon filter system which goes on a municipal system, because as you also know, the Plainfield water system, although it's a municipal system, still has a fairly significant degree of PFAS in it. So we felt that this would be a good test pilot, because they'd been tracking PFAS levels in that municipal system very consistently up until that point. And then with the integration of this system, we'll have a good database that we can hopefully use elsewhere in the state.
And the real implication, other than making sure that water system is clean, is finding out what works, because what we don't know about PFAS is far greater than what we do know, even to the ramifications. But we make the assumption, and there is at least some empirical evidence out there, that this can be really nasty stuff and affect some people differently than others. So this is kind of like the task force that the governor set up. It's kind of the first steps in this, because there are at least 33 states that already know they have this problem.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's not a precedent setting that whenever a municipal system has an elevated PFAS level, we're going to fund a filter system. It's really a test, because the Plainfield Township was early on in this. We discovered it there, and we're going to see if this is a tool that local units of government that operate a system can bring into their system, and we want to know how effective it is before we recommend it to someone else.
And then using that same technology, if it's successful, it could be sized down, I assume, and you might even be able to use it on individual homes. Because one of the problems is, you've got the municipal system, but you have thousands of homes in that area that have their own wells.
Yes, that's exactly right. In fact, in my district, most of the area is not. I represent Alpine Township, and a portion of the Plainfield system services a small portion of Alpine Township, but most of the folks in my district are on well. And so now there are filters that will eliminate the PFAS in-home filters, but this technology, it's emerging. It's an emerging contaminant, so I think we're going to find solutions as we go forward. But if this works, it would be a very useful tool for municipal systems.
One of the things that one of the task force members told me when I first talked with them is that we are in new territory, and that PFAS could be the tip of the iceberg. We don't know what else we dumped in 1955 or 1965 or 1975 that at the time we didn't think about, but now may have some real ramifications. And you were talking about before this started, this isn't something that's going away in 12 months or 18 months, and maybe not in 12 years, because we just don't know the extent, do we?
We don't. The science is we're now discovering where it is, but the federal government has issued a health advisory. When you hit the 9 parts per trillion, the Plainfield system is below that. But when I talk to constituents and I say, they say, what are you going to do about this? And they might have a 4 or a 5. And I said, well, there's no scientific evidence that this is a danger to your health. And their response is, well, that's easy for you to say, but what do I say to my children? And I totally get that. But from a government standpoint, we need real data. What is what are the consequences of this, and where is it? And I think if we just focus on northern Kent County, our focus isn't right, because and we know we're finding more and more areas with PFAS contamination, and that is just one element. So hopefully the academic community, hopefully the federal EPA, federal Health and Human Services will make this a priority as we evaluate that and really try to get our arms around what is the danger level, because we don't know what might have been deposited 20 years ago, 30 years ago. PFAS levels in Lake Erie, PFAS levels in Lake Michigan, some of our rivers and lakes. I think we just saw this week a couple of lakes in Kent County, warnings with respect to fish. So it's an emerging issue, and we need to make it a priority, both on the what do we do practically to deal with what we have, and we need the science behind it to know what's the best strategy long term. But it is going to be a long-term problem.
You used a word, and I think that it will be instructive for our viewers to kind of put it in this perspective. You talked about practical. And what is practical for the government is following guidelines that you can measure and you can see, because there are a lot of things that people might want government to do. There are a lot of things you as a representative might want government to do, but you have to have some kind of a standard so you can say this is when we take action. Otherwise, the pressure on the budget would be enormous for taking care of things that concern people, but might not necessarily be dangerous.
Right, because we have as government, we have limited resources, and we have to prioritize. And of course, public health is our number one responsibility and our number one priority. But what does that mean? Within the public health, what steps are required? And of course, whatever we do, the burden is borne by the taxpayers. So we have to be very careful. In one sense, we want to move immediately and react to an emergency. On the other hand, we need to step back and kind of put our emotions to the side and let's look at the facts, the science, the health implications, and come up with a solution. And I know the DEQ is struggling with that. Senator McGregor, Representative Afandoulis, and I met with the director, and Carol Isaacs, the head of the task force, this week. We are in contact weekly with the DEQ for updates on what's going on, and I think they're struggling with trying to get their arms around this too. And what is the role for the department, and what should we do? What can we do? How do we fund it? What other priorities are set aside? And of course, it's not an easy answer as you really dive into it deeply.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about budgeting, because I think that most people don't know how much time those of you involved in the budget process spend on the budget. Because while the total dollars and cents may be pretty close for this coming year as they were for the last year, and the allocations in broad strokes may be the same, there are a lot of little individual placeholders within the budget that have to be dealt with. One of those that you have been asked by the administration to look at is one that impacts, as a direct impact, a relatively small number of people when you figure it across the state. But it's an important issue. It's the Indigent Defense Fund, and it was started with a governor's commission that looked into this, if I understand it. Explain a little bit about how this originated and kind of where we are.
Sure. Well, Governor Snyder appointed a commission via an executive order a few years ago, and basically the task was evaluate the Michigan system for indigent defense representation. And the commission was made up of members from the judiciary, the bar, the private sector, and they came and they reached out to some other experts. And long story short, Michigan, relative to the other states, spends a lot less on indigent defense.
And we're talking about providing representation for people who are somehow in the criminal justice system but cannot afford an attorney. So we hear it on television all the time. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you, and that's where this comes.
Exactly, and that includes more than simply that statement. Right. And appointing an attorney. I happen to be an attorney. I'm not at all sure I would be qualified to provide an adequate defense for a client, not because I didn't care about it, but simply I don't have the training and the skill set and the experience in that area. So So in 2013, the legislature adopted and the governor signed a bill creating the Indigent Defense Commission and charged them with evaluating our system and developing minimal standards. And when I say minimal standards, I mean minimal standards under the Constitution. So this is not simply what does the legislature think is an appropriate standard, but the Constitution, due process, and so forth requires that we provide this. And so the commission has done its work and it has adopted 4 standards, and then gone to all of our judicial, and we have like 120 different, some counties are multiple county systems. And Kent County, we have the circuit court system, and we have a number of different district court systems. So each of them has looked at the 4 standards and provided an estimate to the Indigent Defense Commission what cost it will be to bring that system up to the standards established by the commission. And we don't have a final number, but the administration is estimating that the cost of that for the next fiscal year will be about $60 million. And we, of course, have not historically funded that, so that's a new item in our budget of $60 million, which is a lot. And my concern, and it's not a concern that the commission's not doing its job, but this is the first phase. They're working on additional standards, which means going forward the cost will be even greater. So we have to find a way to provide funding for that process. And the administration has proposed $45 million general fund, which is our general pot where we pull our money for miscellaneous things, and then $15 million extracted or required from the local systems. And to be candid, there's been a good deal of pushback from the local systems because the bill that was adopted said that the state would cover the incremental cost to bring them up to the standards. So the administration is asking that we tweak the bill. I think the counties or the judicial systems would say it's more than a tweak, but to modify some of the timelines as to when they have to submit, and a lot of, I say minutia, but it isn't minutia because we want it to be organized and in a rational system. But the more challenging thing is to what extent do we require the local systems to contribute to coming up to the standards. And that's the challenge that we're dealing with right now, and I'm trying to find a solution that works both for funding the necessary expenditures, but also I'm sensitive about the cost on the local systems.
Does the law allow for additional costs to be incurred by the court? In other words, could they increase court costs? I know it wouldn't come up to $60 million, but is that one way that they could pay for something like that?
Well, that's they would say that was an impermissible unfunded mandate, and that's something that we're looking into. Putting aside the unfunded mandate question, if these are going to be grants from the state to the locals, I prefer a system where there's some local match to a grant, because I think when you're sending state dollars to any entity or individual or company, they ought to have some skin in the game, because if it's free money, they're going to take it and they're going to spend it. It's just human nature, institutional nature. But when you have to put your own resources there to secure that grant, I think you appreciate the grant more and you're a better steward of those dollars. So I'm trying to, and I don't have a solution or even a good plan at this point, but I'm working on it as we speak, because I hope to have some recommendation for our House leadership, and I'll run it by both the executive and the Senate as well, as to what I think would be a good solution to address the situation.
How the state will pay for those attorneys for people who can't afford them is still an open question. We're back with more To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. This past week in Lansing, the Senate took up action on a package of bills meant to help the survivors of Dr. Larry Nassar. One of those involved was Senator Dave Knezek from Dearborn Heights. Senator, let's start by talking about the process a little bit. I want to get to the importance of the legislation that you and your colleagues dealt with this past week in Lansing as it pertains to those students and others who were harmed by Larry Nassar, and you passed a big set of bills to deal with that. But I want to go back to the process a little bit, because when I got here on Wednesday morning, I was a little surprised to see a real sense of urgency on the part of some people and concern that those bills that had been unveiled to considerable fanfare a couple of weeks ago might be in some jeopardy because they, at least in part, were concerned about one of the provisions, I believe, in your bill, which was the retroactivity. So tell me how that process worked out, because I jokingly said, and I don't want to paint legislators in an unduly bad light, but I jokingly said that cooperation broke out, that you actually came to a compromise, and that is what happened. How did that come together?
Well, the process, as you pointed out, began when, with the survivors front and center, we unveiled this package of legislation here in the Senate just a couple of weeks ago. And as you know, we go through the legislative process, and individuals on both sides of an issue try to come in and have their say. And it was very clear from the beginning that there were some very entrenched interests within the university community, within the religious community, and others who felt very strongly that extending the statute of limitations for crimes of sexual assault or providing any sort of retroactivity for those claims would be a threat to them and their institutions. And what I tried to point out to my colleagues through that entire process is that it was a concern about money, and it was a concern about liability that led us to this problem in the first place. And so we had in front of us a very clear option. One, do you want to stand with the people and the institutions who helped allow these crimes to take place and continue to take place? Or do you want to stand with the survivors who are trying to come to Lansing and bring about some real changes here in our state laws? My colleagues and I yesterday chose to stand with the survivors, and that's something that I'm very proud of.
The retroactive part of that went from 1993 to 1997, and as I understand it, that was the first indication that the university had been notified, and that may be why 1997 was used. But what did that process look like? Because there was a time when it came up to about noon, it was time for committees to start. Everybody took a break, went to committee or did whatever else they did. But I'm guessing you and at least some of your colleagues were trying to work through the details of that between then and 6 o'clock or whenever you finally voted on it.
You know, going into the day, we had some pretty significant concerns that a number of these bills were going to be stripped out of the bill package in its entirety. And what we tried to do at that point was really find the voices of those survivors, bring it back into the conversation to make sure that we were reminding our colleagues just who it is we're supposed to be fighting for and who it is we're supposed to be giving a voice to. The retroactivity component is so important because it allows to the greatest extent possible for every single survivor of Dr. Larry Nassar to have their day in court and to be given a voice that they had been denied for so long. In not so soft terms, I tried to express to my colleagues that every time these survivors came forward and spoke to an adult, they were told to be quiet, they were told to go away, and they were told to keep their mouths shut, and that we as a Senate cannot take a similar tact, and we have to do everything that we can to help provide them with a pathway to justice. And so moving forward, changing those statute of limitations, changing that retroactivity, changing who is a mandated reporter, these are all going to be things that can help bring Michigan out of the dark ages as it relates to our laws around sexual assault.
So now let's talk about the practical impact as you just described what you want these laws to do, but there's some very important parts of that. As I said, 1997 is the retroactive date. There was also a provision that that person who would have been assaulted would need to be a minor at the time of that assault that was included in that package. And if I understand it correctly, if and when the governor signs the package, there'll be a 12-month period in which survivors can take, and this is civil, we should point out this is a civil action,
Right.
This is not a criminal extension, a civil action in that 12 months. Do you expect, is it your anticipation that many of those survivors will take advantage of that opportunity?
I would certainly hope that they do. I mean, the intent from the beginning was to remain laser focused on the survivors and help provide them with this pathway that they themselves have been asking for a very long time. The retroactivity piece, as you pointed out, goes back to 1997, the first time that somebody had come forward to an adult within the Michigan State University community. And we're saying that for individuals who are assaulted as a minor, they will have a 30-year statute of limitations for that crime. The reason being, the average woman who is assaulted as a minor generally feels comfortable coming forward about that situation when she's 41 years old. The average man who goes through a similar situation comes forward around age 38. And so we wanted to make sure that we could be sensitive to that, provide the survivors with the timeline, an appropriate timeline that they need to be able to process and be ready to come forward with really is just a horrendous act that would have occurred when they were a minor. And so moving forward, we thought that was something that was really critical to make sure that we could get this right and provide everybody with the opportunity to seek legal redress.
As you and I talk, the process of funding universities, Michigan State included, going on right here in town. People are trying to decide what the budget's going to look like for the coming year. What, and this isn't part of the package that you passed, but given your investment in this, you must have given this some thought. What is it that MSU needs to do? They've taken some steps. Obviously, the president's gone. Some others have left. But what does that entity need to do to regain the trust of the legislature, for example?
I think first and foremost, Michigan State needs to stop taking such an abrasive approach, not just to the legislature, but to the actual survivors themselves. We heard yesterday from a spokesman at Michigan State that survivors like Rachel Den-Hollander should stay out of the legislative process because he believes that she has no concept of what it is going on here. That type of callous disregard for the voices of these survivors, again, is part of a pattern that we've seen coming out of Michigan State University. To have the president of the institution coming to the legislature lobbying for this package of bills to not just be defeated, but completely thrown out of the legislature doesn't help in regaining that trust. Not just with the legislature, but with the public at large. I think talking about setting up some sort of a victims' compensation fund is a good place to start for the university and would help show some sort of good faith that they're taking these claims seriously, they're listening to the survivors, and they're trying to do everything that they can to make these folks whole.
I want to shift gears, not because we couldn't talk about this for a good long while, but I was thinking about this. We were driving in today, and it's springtime in Michigan.
Yeah.
And that means a couple of things. Many of us look forward to hanging up our top coats and don't look so forward to changing that bent rim.
Right.
Roads, as always, conversation here in Lansing, and road funding remains a question that most people say, no matter what the level is, it's not there yet because we've still got some tough roads. Where are we as that conversation goes on? I know the governor's asked for some more money in this budget.
You know, the money that the governor has asked for, an additional $175 million, plain and simple, this is not enough. The average road, 1 mile, takes $1.5 million to pave. We have a countless number of roads here in the state of Michigan that are not just in average condition, but are in poor condition and will continue to get worse moving forward. What we do know is that back in 2015, the Michigan legislature raised gas taxes and raised registration fees as a way to try and fix the roads. But I think if you were to step outside the office today, you would not see any fixes whatsoever. And so what's frustrating to me is that the legislature feels that they can just wash their hands of this and that they've taken the time and attention that this issue deserves, but we just know that not to be true. Why are Michiganders paying more in taxes but getting a worse product every time that you go out and hit the roads? And we tried just last week to create a fund that would help compensate individuals for those bent rims, for those blown tires. And these were all voted down by the Michigan legislature as well. So I tell folks, pick up the phone, call your legislator, demand more. We've got neighboring states that spend billions of dollars more on their roads. That's why we are going to continue to be in the shape that we are. If we don't have good infrastructure, it's going to impact our ability to attract jobs to this state. It's going to impact our ability to keep talent in this state. And that's something that I know we're all concerned about. We just have to be willing to put our money where our mouth is.
When it comes to road and other infrastructure funding, there will always be the argument about how much and who pays, and that continues in Lansing. We'll continue with To the Point. In the coming week, look for the State House to take up those bills for the survivors of Dr. Nassar. If they pass them, they'll be headed to the governor's office. And the legislature will be taking a break soon. We'll talk about that. And we'll see you next Sunday morning right here on 24 Hour News 8 for To the Point.